everyone. In 1 minute. All right. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to today's Alumni Forum regarding sustainability in this decade. We so appreciate your attendance and would welcome everyone viewing this live on YouTube. I am your host today, Riley Smith. My title is the Alumni and Annual Giving Specialist for the David Eccles School of Business. And I would just like to thank everyone here in person. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend today's forum. We even have an individual who flew from LA specifically for this event. So really exciting things. Just so appreciate all of your enthusiasm and support for today's forum. Just as a heads up for the people viewing this on YouTube, there are individuals here. We do have a live audience, so if you hear some background noise, that's what's going on. I will be introducing the panelists here in just one moment, but I do want to acknowledge the tragic events yesterday that happened in Texas. It's a heavy news day. I've had many discussions with individuals, and the feelings are all the same. Shock, broken hearts, disbelief, anger. We are an educational institution, and an attack on one school is an attack on all. And when third graders and fourth graders can't even go to school safely, that's a problem. And so, in memory of the 19 children and 2 teachers who were killed yesterday, we would like to have a brief moment of silence. Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce our 2 moderators. We have Stephen Cho. He is the sponsor of today's event. It is the sponsor, our sponsor is EV Flow, who did provide the 2 electric vehicle chargers that we will be raffling off today. We will raffle off one for the in-person audience as well as one online. If you are watching this on YouTube, please drop your name in the chat for a chance to win. So thank you, Stephen. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you so much. All right, next, our other moderator is Leanna Robeson. She is a board member for the David Eccles Alumni Network Board, and we are so pleased to have her. Our first panelist is Brock Thane from Castlegate Engineering. Our second is Kevin Emerson from Utah Clean Energy, and our third is Matt Gibbs from Evergreen Consulting. Just want to make sure. Thanks, Matt. And with that, let's give another round of applause for our panelists and moderators, and we'll get going.
All right, welcome, everybody. We'll start, our questions are divided into 4 sections today, and we'll start with section, which is on energy and alternative sources. Utility energy primarily divided into 3 categories: fossil fuel, nuclear, and renewables. Utah's power consists of 80% fossil fuels and only 20% renewable. Compared to the nation, U.S. consists of 60% fossil fuel, 20% nuclear, and 20% renewables. Solar power has increased by 70 folds in the last decade, but only consists of 2.5% of our total energy. So our first question is, what is the current state of renewable energy in Utah, and what is the public opinion on its role pertaining to sustainability? This is an open question to all of our panelists. So any of you wants to take the lead on this?
Well, thanks. That's a great question, and I'll start. I'm going to start with the second part of your question, which is, what do Utahns think about renewable energy? Consistently across the state and the western United States, when people are polled, they consistently want to see a greater transition to renewable energy. A couple of surveys that I found recently looked at the western states and specifically looked at Republican voters and found that 72% of Republicans in the West want to see a greater and faster transition to renewable energy. Here in Utah, close to 2/3 of Utahns believe that Utah should more rapidly transition away from the remaining fleet of our existing coal plants. And 50%, I think it was about 50% of those thought closing those coal plants earlier would actually have quality of life benefits long-term for their families. So there's widespread perspectives from Utahns that want to see a more rapid transformation.
That's might be shocking to some people, thinking that Utah is sort of a red state, but we're actually pretty into the sustainability transition. So next question. Solar power generation is growing rapidly. However, despite its growth rate, what are some of the current challenges solar and renewable energy industries are facing today? Maybe I'll direct that question to Brock first.
Sure, be happy to. So really when you focus on renewable energy, there's really three categories. There's residential, there's commercial, and there's utility. And all of them have unique challenges with them, and all of them have opportunity that's there. And so I'm going to start with the utility sector, and then I'll kind of work backwards back to the residents. And just kind of talk about history with some of the colleagues here, and over the years, 12, 15 years ago, nobody had seen a solar module, a solar panel. And so we did a lot of tours on what does it look like. Today, everyone can point out, yeah, this is what it looks like. They know what they look like. You can see them from here. You can see that they're all over the place. So utility-wise, and we'll get into this as we start talking. What are some of the grid challenges, and how does that interface? Well, because of the demand that's out there, there is a big push to bring on renewable energy, and in the utilities sector itself, there's a big study that has to happen in order to interconnect to these big transmission lines. And so when you're trying to connect to these transmission lines, one of the things that is probably in the utility world, the hardest challenge is how do you actually tie into the grid? And so northern Utah, it's broken into what they call clusters. You have northern Utah, southern Utah, they've added a few more, and then central Utah. That's the easiest way to kind of define that. And what we have is we have choke points. So a lot of the places that you want to put renewables is in cheaper land locations. It's into the utility sectors, and traditionally that's where you would see that, but you can't get the electrons to actually flow to the location. So that is what utility sector is seeing today, is it's very difficult to get a remote large system and get those electrons to the load source. And then the next one was commercial solar. So commercial meaning commercial industrial. You are seeing, and that's been consistently growing, but some of the challenges they have is just getting the return on investments and removing all of the reasons people can say no. Today is products, availability, interest rates, anything else that's out there. Most businesses don't do this every day, and so it's really just removing all the reasons that they could say no. Financially, it always does pencil, but it's always just, is it worth their effort to do commercial solar? And then residential, you guys are seeing it everywhere. It takes a company out there, pushing it. There are a bunch of, and we'll talk about it here, there are a bunch of changes to the rate schedules and constantly changing rate schedules and credibility and things like that. But those are probably the biggest things in the residential market, is just building the rapport, making sure that you're getting what you're actually promised. And as far as deployment financially, it's penciling.
Okay.
If I could just add
Yes.
one thing, it's hopefully an issue that will be resolved soon, but one big challenge right now is a kind of an issue before the U.S. Department of Commerce that deals with foreign manufacturing of solar and different trade issues, that has really put a kind of a downward. It's impacted negatively utilities, solar across the board. There are, I think, somewhere around 5 projects in Utah that are slowed or halted because of this issue that needs to be resolved at the federal level. So this is, I guess, just a quick plug to the powers that be, that we need to resolve that soon and issue an order to expedite that so we can, put that issue to bed and move forward.
So I'll add to that. And when you say they're stalled, what that means is they've went through the utility interconnection. They can connect to the grid. It's still in the ground. They have people that are willing to take it, but they don't have the solar modules, solar panels to actually put them out on site. So yes, it is a huge issue right now.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is the devil's in the details. The utility industry thrives on predictability. And for the last 100 years, you have these big coal plants. But now with all of these new technologies, and they are new, technology still has to advance, costs still have to come down, and the interoperability and the responsiveness of these technologies have to be there. Where in the past, demand response resource, you could, hit a button and in 20 minutes something might happen. Well, the grid doesn't work in 20-minute intervals anymore. The grid works in 30-second intervals for all sorts of different reasons. And so the technology has to be there, the understanding has to be there, and then the financial aspects to encourage the investment has to be there too. So unless you're off the grid, we all rely on the grid every single day, and you expect it to be up. And as we bring these new resources on board, we've got to find ways to keep up with technology and make sure that it's incented to be there.
So that kind of leads to our next question is, what advancements and programs regarding Utah sustainability standings can we expect? What's coming in the horizon?
Well, to kick it off, there's a lot of things that are happening right now and that are forecasted to happen that are very promising and very exciting. For example, we have a bunch of different utilities in the state, but our largest utility is an investor-owned utility, Rocky Mountain Power, a subsidiary of Pacific Corp. The end of last year, they released their latest 20-year integrated resource plan, which is what it's called, where they're planning how to meet utility customers' demands with different types of energy generation and other technologies, including a lot of what Matt talked about that are very quick and responsive technologies. From kind of the advancements that relate to reducing carbon emissions associated with the electricity generation sector, their plan forecasts a 75% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 and a 98% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. That's based on transitioning away from fossil fuel-based power generation. And there's other stats that I'm sure you'll hear that we'll share later that talk about how fast renewables are growing and making up our electricity grid. So it's really exciting. Another thing is there's an innovative cohort of local governments, cities and counties, working with Rocky Mountain Power through a process overseen by our state utility regulators. And they're actually creating something brand new, which is a community-wide utility tariff, where if a city council adopts a resolution to opt in, to participate, that whole community will receive 100% net renewable electricity. And that'll be coming through the utility, but explicitly to serve that community. That hasn't happened before, and it's huge because we have entire cities and counties working with the utility to make that reality a possibility, or that possibility a reality.
Okay, and what factors influence the adoption of renewable energy by both the utility companies and private sectors as a whole?
Well, I might link that question with the prior one.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And if anyone's familiar with like the standard market transformation or adoption curve, it's kind of like a bell curve. It starts kind of slow and then it rapidly increases and then it kind of flattens out and then it goes down again. That's what naturally occurs in the market. The question is do we have time for it to follow that typical transition? And so I'm a big believer as a practitioner of clean energy, making it work in the market, that we need to think about that speed and that transition. So for every market imperfection, there is some market intervention, meaning what kind of program is necessary to speed that curve up. So I think what Kevin talked about is these different initiatives, utility programs, incentive programs to bring down first cost. Those are all necessary for us to be thoughtful as to how we move along that adoption curve. So to maybe be very clear is our policy has to be forward-thinking. So there needs to be incentives to help utilities, to help communities move that forward. And I think we're on that way, but we cannot forget that market adoption is kind of known. And if you want to change it, you have to be thoughtful and you have to be deliberate.
Thank you. Okay, adoption actually leads to our next section, which is the rise and future of EV. So electric vehicle adoption has been pretty fastly growing. Charging electric vehicle as well as maintaining electric vehicle has been cheaper than fossil fuel and cars such as diesel and gasoline vehicles. However, the power to charge electric vehicles, particularly in Utah, as we know, 80% of our power comes from fossil fuel, primarily comes from these fossil fuel sources. And a recent study cited that some EVs, the total carbon footprint does not offset a combustion engine until one has driven it 91,000 miles. And that's because one of the largest components, most expensive component in an EV, the battery, as well as the cost of manufacturing and the process of manufacturing an electric vehicle. So our question first in this section is, are electric vehicles environmentally beneficial if the electricity used to charge them comes from coal or other fossil fuel-based sources? Any takers on this question?
I'd love to jump in on that because that's a great question, and it's not a simple answer. But I think EVs absolutely make sense. Yes, part of the question, or part of the answer and the response, like a lot of these issues, is we can't wait for maybe one condition to be perfect until we start making a transition. We have to start making a transition in one area while a transitioning is happening in another area. So, as I mentioned, our main investor-owned utility, they have huge advancements that are happening between now and the next 20 years to rapidly decarbonize electricity generation. While that's happening, we need to rapidly accelerate the adoption of emission-free at the tailpipe electric vehicles, because the more electricity comes from renewable energy, the more we need to put that renewable energy to use to power everything we rely on in our buildings and in our transportation. So they definitely make sense. And I would say there are the study you cited relates to a specific vehicle, but a recent study out of MIT, I think it came out, do I have the date? It was pretty recent. They found that across the board, EVs, or the emissions that result from lower EVs kind of at the vehicle, make up the more energy intensive and emissions intensive manufacturing process in just 6 to 18 months. So when we look at across the board at all the vehicle fleets, from internal combustion engines, diesels, and electric vehicles, in a very short span of time, they're, I don't know, you could, I guess, think of them as carbon positive. And as our grid gets cleaner, that just only makes electric vehicles cleaner and cleaner every year.
So it sounds like there are some misconception or misinformation regarding EV. So for people who are considering switching to electric vehicle, what are some of the facts and information regarding electric vehicle the public should know?
Utah Clean Energy, and like myself and my team at Utah Clean Energy, we have a lot of ideas about this kind of stuff. So maybe I'll just start, and I'll try to be brief. I mean, one, we kind of talked about it. Kind of where does the power come from, and is it cleaner or not? I think the one thing to keep in mind is that in Utah, according to the Energy Information Administration, I think it was 93% of new electricity generation since 2015 was solar. That trend is only going to continue with solar and other renewable energy sources. So our grid is getting cleaner and cleaner, and as we drive EVs, that's it's a clean way to drive. I think other things relate to range anxiety. I don't know if you folks have heard of range anxiety, but it's this idea that I don't want to drive an electric vehicle because I might get stuck because I might run out of power. Well, the vast majority of urban trips can be made by even a used EV that's a few years old, because most trips are under about 60 miles round trip during the day, and every electric vehicle on the market can meet, those trips. So an EV is a great solution for most trips in an urban setting. And even, I think, for rural settings, more and more we're going to find that because maintenance costs are down and fuel costs are down. Those are two big costs of transportation. And for rural communities where there's a lot more miles driven, electric vehicles have a lower cost.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to go with this. I think the term we're using, because we work in a lot of different communities. We work in urban communities, rural communities, more affluent communities, and then also in communities that have been underinvested for many, many years. And so the conversation we're having is really about mobility and how do we decarbonize mobility as a whole. Some folks don't even have access to cars. How do you decarbonize that whole transition of transportation? So I think mobility is something that we're going to continue to want to talk about broadly. Electric vehicles are certainly a key. I think in the municipal sector, actually, I was just having a conversation about this yesterday. As Kevin said, you don't have to wait for perfect before you can get started. And I think there's going to be a transition as we look at all sorts of different segments of the market. Just take your average trash truck that comes along. Right now it's diesel. They want to electrify it, but electrifying it means that it's going to cost 3 times as much and weigh 4 times as much. Do you want that on a residential street? Maybe, maybe not. And so they really have to start thinking about, well, there's some bridges here. You know, is there a CNG play for some of these that still decarbonizes but is not there until the technology catches up? And I think it's going to be a fascinating journey over the next couple of years to see as the technology catches up, some of these barriers are going to fall off. We'll see some new ones, but I do think that all of these steps, as Kevin talked about, are going to create that transition. And I think it's going to come quicker than we anticipate.
Now, assuming that the adoption is a lot faster than everybody anticipated, and everybody all of a sudden start driving electric vehicles, do we even have enough power, electricity from the grid to, is it going to overload if everybody gets home around the same time and start plugging in their electric vehicle? And how, what technologies or programs are there to deal with these type of, future problems?
Yeah, and I can take that if
Yeah,
you guys
go
are
ahead.
good. So this is what, we talked about what's coming for solar and what's coming for a lot of these things. And really, as Matt mentioned, right, we're working for, we're looking for a 30-second window. What is happening in that 30 seconds and how does it react? And so everything that's getting piloted right now is really how does it interact to the grid? Should it be sending electrons to the grid? Should it be pulling electrons to the grid? And so there's a lot of development here on how do we, get smart homes, get smart communities, and specifically on your question, the average person drives about 39 miles a day. And so if you look at 39 miles a day, what does that relate in power? Right? And what I would tell you is when people come home, if the utility is telling you when to charge your car and when to pull from it, it absolutely can be, because in the utility world, what's happening is certain hours of the day, 4 hours in the day, we're having peak problems, right? We have a huge peak, and the rest of the time we don't. And in fact, even today, there's programs to the utility company today where they'll pay you, commercial customers, to take power in a problematic time frame. So the answer is we have the capacity. It's just really how do you stretch away from compounding the peak. And so really what would happen in that scenario would be pushing that peak on, and then also the ability to solve grid issues such as frequency response and things like that. So that is really what's coming, and that's cars, that's batteries, that's a few other things as well.
And I would just add to that, we've kind of spoken to the fact that there isn't going to be this transition that happens overnight. So we have time, and it's going to take time to make this transition. So the good news is we know what the technologies, we know what most of the problems are. We know what technologies we need to use to put in to solve the problems, and there's things actively happening. So our investor-owned utility, again, Rocky Mountain Power, has a few things going on. One, our state has one thing going on that the utility's involved in. It's a wonky regulatory proceeding about grid modernization, and they're doing a lot of what Brock is talking about, is designing new utility rates so that people and companies and our vehicles and things can use power when it's available and not use power, or maybe even give power back into the grid when that's needed. So that's happening right now, and there's a whole bunch of new things that will be explored and developed now for near-term implementation, including like new meters on everyone's homes that can go both ways. Rocky Mountain Power is also working on pilot testing, kind of smart control electric vehicle charging for big electric vehicles like buses, just downtown here in Salt Lake City. I guess I would leave it at that. There's really interesting things happening right now that are putting these kind of technologies into practice through policy and utility rates and things like that. So it's exciting.
And that leads us to kind of our next section, which is business and environmental challenges. Historically, there's a clear difference between stationary and transportation energy. Electric vehicle and some other technology have kind of blurred the lines between the two. Utah is a net exporter of energy, as each year it generates more power than it consumes. Thus, it sells excess energy to nearby states. This multi-billion-dollar exchange provides up to 30% discount on traditional energy for Utahns. Our first question is it possible to achieve both sustainability and energy independence without compromising the other?
So when I got into this business over 20 years ago, I cannot attribute to who said this, but it was a speaker that said, if it's good for the environment, it's generally good for business. And that has stood true my entire career. If you think about net zero waste in manufacturing facilities, that is it's not only good for business, it's great for the environment. And so I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. And we're seeing it today. Customers using energy efficiency in their businesses and their homes, that not only saves them money on their bills, it also does something for the greater good. It's better clean air, and it's better for our planet. And so they're not mutually exclusive. I actually think they're inextricably tied. And I think as long as we start to see that, we're going to see more advancements and open-mindedness towards, I'd say, clean energy or what was traditionally tree hugger policies.
Okay, well, Salt Lake City is consistently ranked among the worst cities in the world in air quality, as we all know here, and continually receives an F rating. The largest contributor to poor air quality is vehicle emission, which accounts for approximately 55% of the pollution. What are Salt Lake City and the state of Utah doing to solve this issue, and what can business and residents do to help?
Well, I grew up here in the Wasatch Front, and I've seen inversions feel like they're getting a lot worse. And it's been good to see that the community is paying more attention to this and really participating in public processes and making this concern kind of rise to the top. It's consistently one of the top 3 issues when Utahns are polled. Over the llast 20 years, 30 years, Utah's made a lot of progress at the same time. So in addition to people thinking it's a bigger concern and we want to move out of that F ranking from the American Lung Association, Utah has made a lot of progress. A couple of things that are happening kind of related to this space. You mentioned vehicles, and they're the number one source, number one category. Another kind of the next largest category, and the category that will soon be the largest category, is a category called area source emissions. And that's emissions from our homes and our buildings and restaurants and paint shops and even things like the consumer products that we use, like hairsprays and things like that. And it's obviously very difficult to control emissions from all of those kind of varied sources. But good news is there's a lot of things we can do. So it's not a silver bullet approach, but it's more of a silver buckshot approach to address this challenge. The state of Utah today, well, actually, yeah, today, but also just during these months, kind of during this time period, the state of Utah is actually reviewing a newer improved energy efficiency standard for new construction. And as it relates to area sources, when our homes and buildings use less energy, some of that energy that's conserved is a reduction in combustion of natural gas for heating in our homes. So that's one of the myriad things that need to be done to improve. And Utah's currently considering that, adopting the latest 2021 energy standard. There's also huge growth and interest in electrification. So in Utah, most of our heating for space and water heating comes from combustion of natural gas. And that we know how to do it. We know the technologies to move to efficient use of electricity through heat pump technologies. And there's a huge growth in that happening kind of across the state. So that's exciting. And that directly addresses local air emissions as well as upstream emissions in a positive way.
Well, so Utah is one of the most rapid, we have the most rapid economic growth in the nation. How do we sustain that growth without negatively impacting our already fragile ecosystem? With our growth comes higher demand, and how do we sustain that?
Go ahead.
Okay, I think I think it's good business, building practices, good building practices, good business practices. And when you are, as Kevin mentioned, as you're as you're building a building, what are you looking at? Are you looking at your emissions? You know, I would say that, you know, being a double E and looking from the start and kind of talk about progress, you know, over the last 20 years, you know, when we started to do solar, we had public reviews for, you know, a residential system. And today, you know, there's been a streamlined approach to, you know, pushing that through. And I think everyone out there, you know, that they're looking to design the building is at least considering, you know, what are good, you know, building practices. There are other standards that, you know, look for, you know, locally sourced, you know, how many miles it is from the site, what is the carbon offset, you know, and how do they offset that? So I think that is definitely the case. And, you know, if we have good sustainable building practices, I think that you can have both of those.
Anybody else wants to chime in on that?
Well, I believe that, you know, well, first and foremost, you know, the greenest building is one that's never built, but that's not sustainable for growth. And so as we look at, you know, I'm going to probably just echo what you just said, which is, you know, energy efficiency comes first. And I always say that there's never been a ribbon cutting for an insulation job, yet that insulation job may have a greater impact on energy than, no offense, the solar on the roof. And it starts with fundamentals. It starts with the trades, understanding how to do the correct work the first time around. Again, that if they do it the first time around, they do it well. It's cheaper for everybody. So I think we have a number of challenges that we can, you know, really manage to, but I think it starts with just the fundamentals. Building things well, educating the trades, making sure that there's a robust infrastructure to train the trades, and then using the building standards that are continuing to evolve. That then brings us to a place where we're not going to have to fix those problems in a few years, that we're actually starting from a sustainable base to build upon. No reason to have renewable energy that feeds leaks. I am a big believer of efficiency first. When I bought my house, there was ice dam problems. So what do? Well, you put heat tape on, right? No. Heat tape costs about 3 times as what it costs to just do a good air sealing and insulation in your attic. It was cheaper, and now I don't have to pay for heat tape. That same thing applies in so many other areas. So start with efficiency and use solar, use your renewable options for the efficient use of energy.
I'm so glad we're talking about energy efficiency. Just one kind of, I guess, piece of data to share with the folks online and in person. The opportunity that I mentioned, where the state is looking at updating the minimum construction standards for energy conservation. There was a third-party study done by one of the national labs that found that if we did that and looked at the next 30 years of how many homes are going to be built in the state of Utah, and we use this new energy conservation standard, which mainly just makes every building just that much more efficient, we'd be saving 19,000 tons of CO2 every year. We'd be reducing enough energy that we can avoid 19,000 tons with our current electricity generation mix. And that's just with energy efficiency. So that's one of the most important things to do to support our community's continued growth.
And we have sort of naturally transitioned into our last section of our discussion, which is regional policy impact. Utah's economy is one of the strongest in the nation, ranking #1 in economic outlook for the previous 15 years. In addition, Utah has maintained a AAA bond rating since the rating system started in 1965. However, Utah consistently ranked low for sustainability, air quality, and environmentalism. In fact, Utah ranked in the bottom 10 worst states for sustainability, with only 20% of our energy coming from renewable energy. What policies have been introduced or passed in Utah to improve sustainability, and what programs and resources are available to assist businesses, residents who are transitioning to better sustainable living?
Well, I'll start. This is a big one to unpack. I think it starts with customer choice. Who's had, you know, a compact fluorescent, you know, the lights that, you know, look like a McDonald's cone? You know, we all had those, right? Who loved them? Yeah, so, right? Because, you know, they took a while to warm up. The light wasn't that great, and if you broke them, they emitted toxic goo. that was the flagship of the energy efficiency industry, which I kind of was part of, which I am part of. That is not necessarily how you want to lead, change. But then what came along right after that? The LED. And the LED is what customers actually want. Now it's standard. And so I think it starts with customer choice, giving customers viable options that they really want. And as we think about this clean energy transition, customer choice is truly driving this. Customers wanted solar. And you see the amount of money that has to be put into the market as subsidies for solar is coming down. The costs of solar is coming down. That's great. That's natural market transformation. I think we're seeing EVs are going to go in that same boat, and with the battery program that's out there in Utah right now, and that participation, thousands of customers are starting to participate. That's aligning with customer choice. So I think we're going to start. The technology's catching up, and we're giving customers much better choices. I think that's going to, frankly, is where we're going to continue to go.
I'd love to just share a little bit, going from the local and maybe up to the federal policy level, even though we're talking about regional policy impacts. So in the last few years, local governments have played a really important role in changing local policy or exploring new local policy that would open up the market for clean energy solutions. So Park City and Summit County, with the Park City Community Foundation on a project that we were involved with, developed a building decarbonization strategic implementation plan. I think that's what it was called. It's a mouthful. The point is, they're taking account of their building stock, they're taking account of what exists and what doesn't exist, and what levers can be pulled at the local level to incentivize and encourage and promote and remove the red tape for folks to start building net zero buildings and all electric net zero buildings. So there's really, zero emissions on site. So local governments are doing a lot. Salt Lake City's redevelopment agency also adopted a new sustainable development policy. So all of those redevelopment areas in Salt Lake City going forward, projects are going to be net zero, super efficient, and all electric. So we're moving away from combustion of fossil fuels. Then to the federal level, we have an unprecedented opportunity to support programs and kind of launch programs based on funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So every month for the next couple of months, we're going to be seeing application opportunities for local governments and states and industry to partner with folks to make use of some of these billions of dollars that are available to states. So we can't, as a community and as a state, pass up that opportunity to make the best use of those federal funds.
Maybe just a plug for Utah Clean Energy here. They've done a lot and done their part, and maybe Kevin, you can speak to it for everyone here. But not only of leading the from the public sector all the way through down to every individual, making sure it's fair to disadvantaged communities. There's a lot of programs that are out there that you guys have really pushed through as well. That's really helped get to everyday residents. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank all the panelists for answering our pre-generated questions. But now we have a set of Q&A questions that we got from our audience, both from online audience and in-person audience. And I'll pass the Q&A section to Leanna for...
Thank you. Yes, it's Leanna Robinson. I know it's been a while and I've been a little bit quiet, but I'm certainly not a solar expert. But I did have a personal question. Is there any study that was done to find out how COVID impacted energy and just people staying home and not commuting? And I was just curious about that, if there's anything that's been done and how working remotely, could be better for the environment. I mean, it depends upon the employee, obviously, and whether that's a good fit for them. But I was just curious if anything has been released on that.
Well, I remember when the first days of the pandemic and the whole world shut down, you saw some of the pictures of air quality in some of the more developing nations, and it was fascinating to me. I think it was a picture of New Delhi before and after, and it cleared up and it was gorgeous. Mm-hmm. And what occurred to me is that humans have an amazing capacity to do when they choose, and an amazing capacity to not as well. And so I think what that proved to me is that if there's will, we can drive a tremendous amount of change. But the will sometimes gets a bit clouded. I will say from the energy standpoint, when customers move to their homes, we saw, you know, energy usage move to the homes and the residences, which I actually think was a good thing, because so much happens in our home, and it created a focus and an investment into homes. So for efficiency, that was a really positive thing. I'll let the other panelists, you know, comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think that you said it exactly right. I think from a utility side, and just looking at load and capacities, you know, what is that load? Where is it getting? You know, where is it taken at? It definitely moved to the home, and the loads definitely came down. The demand for projects came down, and you know, goes back to how we're using those electrons all day long. And so if we're using those electrons at our home, you know, there's a base load that's there, and it's not that much to add a little bit more. And so what was kind of fascinating was the demand for projects came down. And you know, now as we're kind of opening things back up, it's definitely increasing. The market is what's called short right now. So utilities are, you know, they've kind of planned around that residential side, and now they're scrambling to grab new projects because, you know, that demand is increasing.
Perfect. I guess another question that I had too that I thought of is a few years ago, the chamber had mentioned something about, I believe it's federal legislation that is being passed, or there's something in the works that cars are now manufactured with technology to charge for the miles driven. And how does that impact? And that, to me too, because an electric vehicle too would be using the road, and does that put some kind of kink in that growth, or just how does that impact, and what's the status?
So this is an issue that Utah Clean Energy and a lot of our kind of sister partner organizations have been tracking. There are only a couple of states that are exploring paying for roads through how many miles you drive. The standard way that we pay for roads is by paying at the pump. You pay a tax, and all or a large portion of that tax goes to fund state highway building projects. That works, and it's worked for decades, but it disincentivizes fuel-efficient vehicles or vehicles that don't use gasoline, because then they're not contributing to helping to maintain and pay for roads. So the solution is a road user charge program, or a VMT, vehicle miles traveled program. A few states are piloting programs. Utah is one of them, and I think in a lot of respects that's the future for how we're going to be paying for road maintenance. But it's kind of up in the air because obviously we have 2 states piloting this, and we have 50 states and some other territories that aren't doing that yet. So we have a long way to go.
Thanks. I had heard that, but I hadn't heard any follow-up about it, so I was just curious. Okay, so I want to make sure that our audience members, do you have any questions since you're live? And Mike Hill.
I have a quick question. So, you know, there's the Tesla Powerwall. Oh, thanks, Riley. So there's like the Tesla Powerwall, I think is what it's called, but it's basically a home battery. I saw a Wall Street Journal article talking about cars functioning as a home battery. So they charge when power, you know, consumption is at a low, and then give back to the house essentially during the high power consumption times. I mean, do you guys see that as a real viable option in the future, or is that just hype from Ford and Porsche who are doing these pilot programs?
Yeah, I'll take this one, and I would tell you, yeah, it's there today, right? It's called a parallel generation connection, and some utilities have it. It's, you know, maybe not local here in Salt Lake today. They do have it for generators, but if you sign up a parallel generation, you get an export rate and an import rate. And you're seeing a lot of utilities over the last 100 years change the way that they sell and how they buy power. So a lot of utilities are moving to time of day use and time of day demand, and that is inclusive to the residential sector. So, you know, in a commercial world, we buy power as energy, and then we have to have the pressure on the grid, the pump essentially to feed the grid. And so you pay for both of those. And so what you're seeing in the, you know, from the policy side is a lot of people move to new ways and new developments on the way that we buy energy. And so there's no question the way that we will buy energy in the future will be what you're talking about. You know, the price of power today at, and there's an app for this. You can see where at different nodes what it costs. But it probably costs, you know, in Utah, probably 3 cents a kilowatt hour, roughly. And, you know, on the peak side, it's probably up to 17 cents. So take that as an example. If you charge at the 3 cent and sell at the 17 cent, then it helps on your returns. But yes, that is absolutely the case, that it's functioning.
The car will be the thing that does it, or do you think we'll have like the Tesla Powerwall? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that that'll be part of it, but I think it's everything. It starts from energy efficiency first, reducing, you have that incentive to reduce your power, and then I think after you go through your energy efficiency, then you have the car, and then you have the solar, and to back that up. And there's other generations out there besides solar that you guys could, that anyone can take advantage of, but solar is the most known for most people. Yeah.
All right, we do have a question from YouTube. This is from Jonathan Atkin. He asks, what are some challenges for apartment and condo owners with electric vehicles, and what can be done to mitigate those challenges?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is again, going back to the power of local governments can set certain rules that helps to make sure that new multifamily, especially, there's probably different solutions for existing multifamily buildings, but the new multifamily buildings are electric vehicle or EV ready, so that the kind of the wiring and the conduit, possibly the charger, but at least the wiring and the conduit are part of kind of the, planning your parking lot or your parking structure for multifamily housing, so that renters can easily charge, where they park. That's not standard practice. The codes and standards are moving that direction. One thing that's happening locally is Salt Lake City's planning department and Salt Lake City Council are actually, now-ish looking at a possible update to Salt Lake City's planning and zoning to require this kind of thing, so that multifamily housing has the capacity for EV charging. That's extremely important, and that's, I think, one of the solutions that we need. Rocky Mountain Power is also investing $50 million a year in electric vehicle charging infrastructure in a variety of different ways. Some of that also includes incentives for renters and homeowners, to buy a level 2 charger and, help get a break on it from the utility. So there's things happening.
Looks like we have some questions in the front, so I'll let Riley take the mic over to you.
Thank you. So I think everyone knows about this and is concerned about this. So if we see through that window, we might see a little layer of fog that is made up of hydrocarbons, CO2, methane, etc., mostly coming from vehicles, right? The thing is, those greenhouse gases and that greenhouse effect is affecting the Great Salt Lake and is drying it up. Yeah. In my opinion, and there is a scientific debate about this. What if the Salt Lake dries? And remember, the Salt Lake is a basin, where basins are they gather up heavy metals. Yeah. What happens with those heavy metals are they get flown away by the wind and then get thrown back into the city. So it's basically like a time bomb. We're racing against the clock, and I think my question is, what are do you know about this, more about this? Does the legislature know about this, or is it just a scientific debate?
I'd love to speak to this. I, in a past life, served on the board of a local organization, Friends of Great Salt Lake, so I'm familiar with some of the Great Salt Lake issues. You're right. The health of the Great Salt Lake impacts our local air quality. You wouldn't think it would, but it absolutely does right now, and it will more in the future if we don't take care of the Great Salt Lake. The good news is I'm not familiar with all of the legislation, but there was a historical amount of legislation enacted during this last legislative session earlier this year to protect the Great Salt Lake from energy, from water conservation at homes, with agriculture, with a whole bunch of different approaches. So the Great Salt Lake is finally getting the attention it deserves. It is a hemispherically important wetland for millions and millions of migrating waterfowl from the tip of South America all the way up to Alaska. So, for that reason, it's important. But like you said, air quality in Utah relies on us protecting the Great Salt Lake. And all the policies passed last year probably aren't quite enough. But it was great that that the state legislature is taking account of it and trying to do something.
Looks like we have another question there. You're welcome to come up here too. I'm on a leash, so.
So I wanted to ask, you guys talked about a lot of the new homes being built all throughout Utah. But is there going to be any sort of like third-party systems that's going to be able to like go into an older home like the neighborhoods in Sugar House, right, and be able to make them energy efficient without looking at doing a full remodel or a full rebuild? Is there anything that's going to be in place for that in the future?
Well, that exists today in some level, and the utilities have energy efficiency programs that can help consumers, and they're looking at enhancing those programs and continuing to evolve those to be even more customer friendly, so that you can get out there and get the advice that you need. But both the electric and the gas companies do have resources to support that. I do believe that from a policy standpoint, there has been a lot of retrofits in homes for the purposes of granite countertops and new tiles and new showers, but there hasn't been culturally an integration with the energy performance side of that community. And so there's a lot of home remodelers, they do great work, but it is not also incorporating the efficiency side of that. I think that's an area of opportunity. We see that in Denver, you see that in Portland and Seattle. There are whole companies that's what they do, green energy retrofits. I would like to see that Utah build up that community, and I think there is, as Kevin talked about, there's funding that is available maybe through federal or through state, and I think that could also supplement some of the utility funding and some of the community funding to do so. So I think it's a great question, and frankly, I think it's necessary for us to continue to evolve.
If I can chime in. So actually there's already a lot of incentives and rebate programs available for existing homes. So before you upgrade your next thermostat or whatnot, check the utility websites, state websites. There are rebate programs, and they make it very, very easy to reclaim those rebates, even through the retail purchasing process. So.
One thing I want to put on your radar as well, I think the federal funding is an absolute must-do. The state has to take advantage of the federal funds, because a lot of them target workforce training and development for really anything, including residential energy improvements and small businesses. But there's so much funding available. Utah actually passed a piece of legislation a couple sessions ago, and since created a kind of a pilot program which would give every existing home, and it could apply to new homes after they're built, give them a kind of an energy score. So they have kind of like a miles per gallon rating. So you can compare this home to this home to this home, and if you rent or own a home that's has a really low energy score, you know how much better it can get. So it helps guide those retrofits. That's something that the legislature also is looking at, and now that state agencies are looking at actually putting some structure around that kind of pilot program. But it helps kind of feed that same idea of existing homes and making them more efficient.
All right, we have time for one more question. This is coming from YouTube. David Bennett asks, the current federal incentive to install residential solar is 26%. This is scheduled to decrease next year, but is there a possibility of an increase to 30%? What are your thoughts?
Yes, I can take this. And so yes, it's they are definitely opportunities for it to increase. In fact, just recently, in the Build Back Better, it was in that. It was drafted in that, and it's something that they're looking at towards the end of the year. So what we're at least hoping for, I can't speak to whether they, go up to 30% where it used to be, but what we're at least hoping for is that they could do a stay to go 26% for future years. But there is a lot of people that are pushing to keep a 26% tax credit.
All right, thank you so much. Let's give a big hand to our panelists and our moderators. Thank you so much. We so appreciate your willingness and your availability to come and speak with all of us today. Just as a quick wrap up, any final thoughts from any of you regarding anything we've discussed today? And then once we conclude, we will raffle off those EV chargers.
Well, maybe I'll just take 10 seconds. I think, to your last point, or one of the last questions, Utah is actually really leading in a lot of areas, and I am really excited to see the future with energy efficiency, sustainability, and the policies that are going to help clean our air and decarbonize our buildings and in our homes. And so I think that Utah is in a really good spot and needs to have the continued public will to want to do so. So we're not starting from zero. We're actually starting from a really, really good spot, but it's going to take all of us to know that it's important.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I guess the parting thought I would leave folks with is we haven't talked about climate change explicitly this morning so much, but all the things we've talked about are inextricably connected to it. This is the climate decade, and we have a lot to do, and it's not all up to us, but it is up to us to be part of it. It sometimes feels daunting. Like, what are we going to do to expedite the changes that are needed to address, the climate emergency, globally? And keep in mind, it's a climate decade. We're at a place where we're not at the bottom of a hill pushing the boulder up. We're actually really near the top of the hill. There are a lot of hands on the boulder, and the boulder is the solutions, by the way. It's about to take a dive down the other side of the hill, and those solutions are going to be put into effect. So it's important to keep that in mind and talk about it. Talk about it with folks you wouldn't normally talk about, because we need to give attention to this issue so we can get the solutions implemented.
Yeah, and just final thoughts for me. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak with all of you and all of your efforts. And I thank you for that boulder. There's a lot of people out here that have been pushing that boulder up the hill. And I think, just like as you guys have said, it takes everybody here to push that, keep pushing that boulder. And then what I would just say on top of that is realize that it's a community effort, right? So you're seeing a lot of things moving to communities, as Kevin mentioned, not just one building, but how does that affect the community? How do you properly design a community? So as you're out there, pushing change and pushing things, look at it as you were suggesting, as our community, and I think that'll guide you in the right direction.
All right, thank you again so much. We so appreciate everything you've said today. Let's give it up for our panelists one more time. All right, now for the big moment. Very exciting. So we'll do the online one first. For those viewing this on YouTube, let me get my phone out. Whoops. All right. So we did take those names and we did put it in a randomized drawing, and the winner is Mitchell Wolfman. So Mitchell, congratulations. Very exciting. We will have an individual contact you to obtain your contact info so we can get this to you promptly. And now for the in-person. I think our sponsor should raffle this one off. Let's have him select it.
Dakota Rose.
Dakota, what's up? Congratulations. Yeah, that's way exciting. All right, perfect. Dakota, if you'll stay afterwards so we can get your information and get this out to you. Again, we want to thank our sponsor, EV Flow, for producing and providing today's forum. For those of you who are still viewing and in person, please be sure to follow the David Eccles School of Business Alumni Network on all of our social media platforms, especially Forever Utah. And again, just want to thank each and every one of you for attending today. And of course, go Utes.